So welcome to another Whisky Circus, everybody. It's with great pleasure we've got quite an exciting speaker today with Dominic Roskrow. So obviously, normally we've had the industry people from the making whiskey side. We've kind of gone to the other side now and got somebody who's not only written about it, but talks about it constantly, has a very big passion, and unlike myself, is a proper journalist. So, you know, it'll be nice to get a different perspective and talk about things, and not just only Scotch. So for those who don't know Dominic, I'll hand over to Dominic now and let him introduce himself, and then we'll go from there. So over to you, Dominic.
Hi, well, thank you first of all for having me on today. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm Dominic Roskrow. I'm a whiskey writer and author, and I do bits of consulting work and stuff like that. Really, I've just been incredibly lucky. I came back from New Zealand in '91, and there were no jobs, and I happened to, it was during a recession, and I happened to get a job in a drinks magazine, writing for the trade, for clubs and then for pubs. And it just happened, I met somebody from Norfolk, and I was commuting to and from, and Whisky magazine needed an editor. They had 4 titles, but the Whisky magazine was the main one, and they needed an editor in Norfolk, in Norwich. So it was a dream situation. And at that time, I didn't know anything about whiskey at all. I could tell you the percentage share of blended whiskey in the market.
Oh, Greg, that was meant to be to you. But meant to be a little tap.
Isn't it?
It's all right. Somebody hadn't muted themselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, carry on.
All right, mate.
My consulting editors at that time I didn't know anything about tasting whiskey at all, nothing. But my consulting editors at that time were the legendary Michael Jackson and the legendary Dave Broom. So I had probably 2 of the best 3 ever whiskey writers, I would say, possibly. And then, as you know, once you start going to distilleries and you meet all these humble people, they think you're doing them a favour coming to speak to them. But in actual fact, I always describe it like being one of those little fish that feed off the great white shark. The great white shark are the distillers and the industry going forward, the whiskey industry going forward. And people like me are feeding on the back of their skin and getting taken along for the ride. So I was just incredibly lucky. And that all happened around the turn of the millennium, just after the turn of the millennium. Yeah, and I've been doing it ever since. I just feel incredibly fortunate.
Yeah, I mean, I know just before we started recording, I kind of said that we would go backwards, forwards, but maybe it's a better idea to go from the back and come back to the more modern thing. And you know, I know you from working from the books that I've bought that you've written and things like that, and I know you've been very passionate about things. And what made you go from sort of mainland or mainstream journalist to actually writing books then? Is it just a natural progression?
That's a very good question, really, because I think it's changing as we speak. You know, the death of publishing has been a long and slow one, and I wouldn't like to start again now because newspapers are in a lot of trouble. This pandemic virus will kill off a lot of publishing, without a doubt. Both the magazines that I was editing, one's closed and the other's suspended. Both have some plans to come back online. So whether that happens or not, I don't know. So, but back in the day, it's actually quite appalling how ruthless it is. When you publish a book, you get contacted by a company normally, and they ask you to do a synopsis and a dummy chapter and maybe chapter headings. And then they take it to one of 2 book fairs, the Frankfurt Book Fair and the London Book Fair. One's in April and one's in October. And they literally set up a stall, and people from all over the world who are into publishing come and have a look at what they're offering. And if that Australian or American publisher takes up your whiskey offering, you get commissions. But you don't get royalties. So, well, that's not entirely true. I've got 3 books on royalties, but normally you don't. They give you an advance, and that money has to be repaid back against sales. No, that's not true. That's with royalties. Without royalties, you just get an advance. That's it.
Yeah.
If you get royalties, you pay back your advance, and then anything on top of that is sent to you every 6 months in a check. But that's really, really rare. And what they do is they go, and if you're a budding whiskey writer and you really want to get somewhere, and someone comes along from a major publishing house and says, "We'll give you 10 grand to write a book," you bite their hands off. The trouble is they're underselling. That's not a huge amount of money, and they're making a lot more out of it than you are. And it undermines established people because you're you and fresh face, and who can blame you? I see it happening a lot now. Why not? Why would anybody get the chance to write a book, not do it? So it's a natural progression in one sense, but actually the methodology is very, very similar. To me, the most important thing is trying to do something new. And I hate being asked to write another chapter on how to make whiskey. I think it's been done to death. And I apply the same principles that I did when I worked on newspapers, which is, if somebody's read it before, it really shouldn't be there. You know, my classic favourite one in whiskey is closed distilleries. Anybody who offers to write you a feature on closed distilleries is getting it from someone who's already written on closed distilleries because they're closed. Yeah. So what you're basically being asked to do is pay money for somebody to rewrite somebody else's feature. Drives me crazy. And as you well know, actually, especially in the last, 10 years, 5 to 10 years, there's so much happening new that there's really no need. I mean, how could you not find a new story? Yeah. When I started off, it was much harder because we hadn't reached the micro distilling craft wave. We hadn't got there yet. So maybe it was tougher finding out. So, but I just couldn't believe the laziness. I'll give you an example. If you, I'm sorry if it sounds really critical. I'm not. I once got asked, did I really ring up every time I got a press release? And I said, absolutely, every time, for 2 reasons. One, I want to hear them tell me directly it's true. And 2, I want to get an angle that isn't the same as every other press release written copy. If you look up the definition of pot still whiskey, you will find 150 times it says pot still whiskey is whiskey, Irish whiskey made with malted and unmalted barley. And actually, that's not the definition at all. Malted barley and an unmalted other grain is the technical definition. But it's been in the press releases so many times, it's become the norm. And it in print the whole time. And in books, it's incredible. So that's all I'd say about that. I think it would be a natural progression if people were still publishing books, but I'm not sure whether that particular mountain has been conquered.
I mean, what kind of interests me with yourself especially is, obviously you're what I call an old school journalist. It's pen and ink type thing. And the kind of more modern thing is obviously going like myself, who I nearly said pretends to be a blogger, but sort of goes down the blogging line, very unprofessional. I do it as an amateur. I do it as an opinion for myself. You've got yourselves who are journalists, and you've got the vloggers as well. And how important do you think having the 3 different styles is? Or do you think it's very damaging in a sense to the industry to have so many voices now?
No, I don't think that at all. I've often said, I'll say it again now, I think it's absolutely fantastic that there are so many people taking part. I don't think, so my eldest son is 22 years old, and he's dabbled with a little bit of whiskey, but it wasn't our generation's drink. It was my dad's drink. I'm 58, and our generation drank vodka and lime and rum and black, if we drank any spirits at all. And we've all done the classic of got sick on a late night blended whiskey and been put off it for years and years. So for my son's generation, they're going to look to you and to their friends and to their peers in their age group and on their social media. And every time someone like me tries to copy onto social media, they just find another way of doing it. And that's brilliant, because at the end of the day, that's all I ever did. All I ever did was get a job in whiskey and was enthusiastic enough to take it as a passion. And that passion is massively important. And I see it all the time in blogging. There are things I don't like about blogging, but I don't think old school is, it's like me saying, I still listen to lots and lots of music. Music's huge to me.
Yeah.
But my sons, you know, and I was reading about, I'm going to forget the name now, but I was reading about Somebody the Jewels the other day, a rap duo who are two separate rappers who Run the Jewels, I think they're called. And it actually, they just dropped, I can use a terminology, they dropped a new album, and on it came out just before the whole Black Lives Matter thing took off again. And it actually has a line in it about saying, don't do that, I can't breathe. It's incredible. Now, I go to my sons, and yeah, they've already got it downloaded. You know, of course they have. I'm not trying to compete with that. I can't. I'd be worked up for wrong. It's exactly the same in whiskey. I'm so glad I've had the career I've had, and I'm so glad that I'm still, and that somebody like you wants to talk to me. But I think it's really, really healthy that a new generation is coming through with new idea, new thoughts. And I'm sure we're going to talk about world whiskey to an extent, but actually it's been happening on the world stage for quite a long time. And what's refreshing is they're not bound by the old ideas. They're thinking out the box, you know. I don't want to see the standards thrown away. I think there's a need to protect them for people like myself and the old school to, you know, to make sure that the barriers are respected. But for a whole new generation to come and say, I'm inventing effectively whiskey's answer to rap music or to whatever, grime or whatever it is. Brilliant, great stuff.
No, I mean, I'm kind of glad that you brought world whiskies up there. I mean, I'm kind of trying to leave that a little bit for now, because I know that's going to probably be quite a major part of what we talk about. But I know over the years you've constantly sort of mentioned the fact that Scotch whiskey is the best whiskey out there still, and obviously they are kind of the leaders going forward, or certainly in the past. But do you kind of think world whiskey is catching up, and do you think it will overtake at any point, without going too much into world whiskey, because we will talk about it in a bit?
In a word, no.
No.
My simple answer that I've used many times is, if you're going to make whiskey, there are only two ways to do it. Exactly the same way that Scots do. And if in that case, you've got to be bloody good because they've had 1,000 years practice.
Yeah.
Or two, in a different style and different way, where you actually change people's perceptions of what they're tasting. I have my own awards, and my awards, my judges are all people who've drunk world whiskey with me for 15 to 17 years. And that puts them at an advantage over one of the big IWSC or IWC tastings, because they taste all this wine and then all this great fortified liqueur and then onto spirits. And their reference point for spirits is for whiskey is Scotch. And sometimes it's a palate. It's like the difference between fish and chips and Vindaloo curry. You know, if you want to compare Vindaloo to fish and chips, it's going to taste horrible to you. Yeah. Because you want fish and chips. That's the whole point, though. It's meant to be different. So I don't think it's a matter of catching up. I think there are huge numbers of distilleries now who are actually very reverential towards Scotland and the whiskey it makes, and Ireland, and bourbon in America. But they also are respectful, but forging their own path. And actually, I think they will establish their markets. But it's almost like Alpine whiskey is almost like gin to Scotch whiskey. So it's almost a new category. A lot of people don't necessarily appreciate that bourbon is whiskey because it's so radically different to Scotch. But that's the point. An Australian category, an Austrian category, a Swedish category are just giving us drinkers, us whiskey fans, better and more choice. But whether I don't think it's a race. I don't think, I mean, the thing is, it's they're not racing up and down the pool. They're basically Scotland saying, come on in, jump on in. And if you need a hand swimming, we'll give you a hand. But we're here to have fun, and we're quite happy to help you because we're established. So I think it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah. So, I mean, I recently watched, you was chatting, and I can't think of the chap's name. I think it was a couple of weeks ago. And you mentioned kind of the SWA and the European laws on things, and the differences, and how well you think the SWA is, and certain aspects of that needing to stay. do you think, though, the SWA kind of need to look and change the rules to become a bit more current, or do you think it's kind of needs to just stay where it is?
I think you've got to remember that you particularly, and people listening to this, you're very much front line. And the thing about being on the front line, and it's the same with journalists, you want something new and exciting, and sometimes you forget that actually behind you are 97%, 95% of people who are just happy the way things are. And Scotland doesn't need to fix what's not broken.
Mm.
I think one of the things I would say is I think that they've made a mistake with it wasn't a mistake because it's totally legal and it was totally acceptable. But there are a lot of non-age statement whiskies I think that aren't fit for purpose. I think once Scotland lowers the barrier, it's under a lot of threat from a lot of other distilleries worldwide. But in terms of the basic standards, I think it's necessary more than ever now that we're exiting Europe, probably without a deal because we've passed the June 30th deadline. So we now have to leave on December 31st without a deal if it's not done. And they're not really talking. I mean, it's not great. And I do worry about where Scotland fits into all that, because Scotland basically has had a lot of support from the European common market over the years. When the EUC goes into India, it fights the corner of, or did fight the corner of Scotch, right in the top 3 products. So I don't think the SWA should change. I think it needs to pick its fights better. It's a bit like Cameron many years ago when they really had won the real ale argument. So they started picking fights that weren't there to be fought. So I'll give you a small example of that. And I mentioned it the other night, and somebody came back to me from a distillery in Scotland. I used to have a miniature club, the Whisky Tasting Club. The reason I'm called that Whisky Tasting on Twitter is because the Whisky Tasting Club set my Twitter account up for me, and that was how we used to do miniature packs. And what we'd do is we'd talk to the distillers, buy the whiskey at a wholesale cost, and we'd decant it into little bottles, and I'd do tasting notes and some write-up, and we'd post them out to people who paid £25, whatever it was. And the SWA stopped that. We got very, very heavy-handed legal letters about the fact we were in England, and therefore we weren't able to open a bottle of Scotch, decant it, and call it Scotch whisky because it wasn't bottled in Scotland. Now that's ridiculous. There wasn't a distiller who thought we were, and there are other stories. Mac Myra, the Mac is spelled M-A-C-K, but the SWA had an issue with the word Mac because it's Scottish. They said they had to put the word Swedish on the label. And Mac Myra said, "Oh, jolly good, because we might have done that anyway. You know, why do you think we're trying to be Scotch? We're not. We're trying to be Swedish whiskey." Escapes me the name, but the Canadian Glen Scotia, expat Scots who settled in Canada, as a lot of Scots did, and they're from a region that's got Scotia in the name, and they made Glen Scotia, and they told they couldn't use it. So I think sometimes it's the old thing about using a hammer to crack a nut. But do I think they have a purpose? Absolutely, more so probably than ever.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a couple of little things that I was going to bring up in this segment. So one was age statements versus no age statement. I mean, do you think, in a sense, that we should maybe bring age statements to everything, or do you think actually age statements are kind of redundant because it gives a false impression?
The first thing to say about that, and I think it probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, age isn't necessarily a full guide to the quality of a whiskey. And you know, I remember many years ago when I first started, Sukhinder Singh at the Whisky Exchange invited me out for an evening of beer and curry. But before we went out, he said, "Let's have a dram." He said, "What sort of thing would you want?" He said, "And before you do this, and pick a 35-year-old, 40-year-old rare whiskey," he said, "if you like peaty whiskey, and you do, can I choose the whiskey for you?" And he did. And he gave me this whiskey, and it was one of the best peated whiskies I've ever had in my life. and it was a 4-year-old juror, peated, and this is way, way before any juror was peated. But they'd done a special bottling for Australia, I think it was, and so again, it was stunning. It was just stunning whiskey. So I think that's the first thing to say. I think age is important, but I also take on board so when I started writing about world whiskey, I became very close to the Australian market and remain so. I've got a lot of good friends. I'm very disappointed that next month I won't be going out to Tasmania to head the judges for their Tasmanian Whisky Festival, because it's obviously not happening. But I'm in touch with Australians a lot, and they basically are irreverent. I mean, I do a comparison between Australia and Sweden, and the Australians basically, their whole attitude is, why are you chucking us in a category called the rest of the world? You know, you have the 5 main markets, and then you have everything else is almost second rate in the rest of the world. And what have we got in common with Sweden, India? Nothing. So that's the first thing I learned from them. The second thing I learned from them was age is absolute, and this is going back 18, 19 years. These questions weren't really being asked. They were saying, look, Australia has different climate, it has different humidity, it has different extremes of climate. We use different sized barrels. If you put an age statement on something, what we can't do 12 years. So it's no good putting us in a category of less than 12 years and over 12 years, because we can't do it. But we can produce really great whiskey at 4 or 5 years, and somebody's just appeared. It's not you.
That was Fiona, yeah. It's just moved. But I mean, one thing, again, jumping slightly back into what you were saying earlier, the fact of, from what I know about you, you were one of the first sort of subscription whiskies to go out there, and it's interesting to hear you say that the SWA stopped it because you were decanting to rebottle, and that's kind of, to me, a very pathetic excuse to stop something.
Yeah, I think it's important at the moment, actually. I've been talking to a couple of people about this. One of the things that people are looking at, whiskey clubs outside Scotland have been looking at, is basically doing samples. And there's a big company who does shows all over the country, and I don't want to name them in case it's not something I should be discussing, but basically they're discussing when you go to their whiskey event, they're going to limit the numbers and, you know, social spacing. But instead of a masterclass, you will pick up a box at the end of your session, and you will do your masterclass at another time from home.
Yeah.
That way. But to do that, they're going to have to put lots of little bottles out, and immediately that puts them exactly where we were. And it's the same with any club that's looking at doing a virtual tasting and saying, look, we'll send you out some samples. And it takes some organisation. I know Dublin's looking at doing the same thing. But the problem is, if you're doing a Scottish tasting in Dublin and you're decanting those out for the Dublin market, that's against the rules. So these are the petty things that need to be cleared up. And the outcome of this is that a group of us were going to take this up and invite other people to join, maybe even form with people like yourselves a sort of an independent forum where we throw in ideas. What are the issues facing us? I'm not seeing it as a commercial enterprise, purely as a supportive enterprise of finding ways that people can cross-pollinate ideas to give us some future. Because if you're running whiskey shows at the moment, you could be looking at another 6 to 12 months. And, you know, as we were saying, lockdown might come back. I mean, I'm from Leicester, so, you know, we're not even coming out. I'm not in Leicester, but Leicester is where I'm from. And I've got relatives there, and it's all very sad. That's not going to be the last place to be really locked down. It's just not. So we've got to find ways around that. So anyway, we're on to a tangent a little bit. But yeah, I think that the SWA, perhaps, I would say it's a fortress, and it can draw up its drawbridge, or it can lower it. Well, I think it needs to lower it to help the industry and provide for the smaller ones. Because, of course, the SWA, let's not be around the bush, it's owned and run by the biggest distillers. So not in their interest, really. In fact, when I set up the Craft Distillers Alliance a few years ago, we went into a meeting, myself and John from Compass Box. We were called into a meeting with the SWA, and they threatened us directly. They said, if you try and get tax breaks, the small distillers will stop you, and you won't be able. because we'll keep you in court for so many years with our money, and they would have.
Yeah.
So, you know, sometimes I think we're on the same side, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one because, like you say, I mean, at the moment, a lot of the small independent whiskey clubs around that are, you know, they're getting the bottles in and then distributing them out themselves. And essentially, then this is against the law or against the SWA rulings to still be able to call it Scotch then.
Yeah, unless something's changed in the last 5 or 6 years since we were stopped. Yeah, we had an office in Norwich, and we got to the point. It didn't make us a lot of money. There were 4 of us. We were friends, still are friends. Each of us had a different skill set. Mine was the writing and the whiskey knowledge, but Tony was the MD and did the business side, and Pat used to do a lot of filling and organising stuff. We had an office in Norwich, and it was all very nice. And at Christmas, we got a bonus. It was about, you know, 12,000. No, not even that. £8,000 maybe between 4 of us. It wasn't going to make us rich. But we were stopped. We were told to take down all our websites and everything very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So unless something's changed, there you go.
I mean, somebody's just kind of asked, how does Master of Malt get away with it? But I'm assuming they're possibly bottling it in Scotland or rebottling it. Yeah.
That's what they had to do.
Yeah.
Exactly what they had to do. Go and set up an office in Scotland.
Yeah. Because I know...
Have a company, so who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I know I've spoken to a couple of the sort of subscription people, and you know, they've told me how big a minefield it actually is. So, you know, I'm suspecting that things do not change. It's just there's ways round it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's mind blowing. It's kind of ridiculous. I mean, we was talking to David from France, and we're talking to Louise from Ireland, and you know, some of the legislations they're telling us about where you can't put an age statement on one bottle and you can't call it this on another, and you just, I know that's not the SWA necessarily, but you kind of think surely anything that is going to benefit these companies should be allowed, as long as it's not breaking the law and it's not misinformation.
Yeah, I think there are bigger fights to fight.
Yeah.
You know, all the battles they have with Indian producers passing off fake bottles, and I maybe shouldn't name one country like that. It's a bit harsh, but I mean, Australia's had the same problem, and well, there's lots of places to have. They're the battles that matter because it's quality of the product that needs preserving or looking after it. And I just think that we're in for a very rocky, maybe 18 months, and I think that's every little helps. Any help anybody could give just to turn a blind eye for a while. You don't even have to set a precedent. You just need to not make a fuss, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, one thing with like where I was kind of going with the SWA is kind of like with cask choice as well, where obviously Glen Murray got into a lot of trouble with the cider cask, but then we're allowing tequila casks, possibly because it's one of the big conglomerates that's pushed it.
Absolutely. So you talked about the SWA and whether it needs a reform or not. Well, there's a classic example. It has loosened its rules, but I just don't get it. I can't. I drink cider, you know. I just can't understand why beer's okay. Beer is okay, isn't it? Yeah. You can use
IPA cask and that, can't you? So it's just not cider.
Yeah. So no, I'm with you. I think those things are minuscule. You know, I mean, some of the white wine casks they're using and stuff. You just think, really? I mean, I've tasted some stuff that's just so sweet, and you just think, I guess. But then it comes down to personal choice. I don't know. We are in that quicksand area where you know, it needs a lot of thinking about. But you'd hope common sense would prevail, wouldn't you?
Yeah, because I mean, you know, the one thing that I look upon the Scotch whisky industry is that, like we've said, you know, it is the leading industry. It is the one that other countries do look up to, and in theory, it's probably the one with the best governed system, but you kind of just still think it's almost as if it's an aging process, and they can't look to the future. They just want to stay where they are. And you think with the Scotch industry that it still needs to progress a little bit. You know, it can't allow itself to get stagnant.
But I mean, I've got another theory on this altogether. It's that I think the key word here is transparency.
Yeah.
If you know what you're buying and you know what it is, and if it breaks the rules of what is whiskey, then come up with a related name. I mean, I'll go back to John Glazer at Compass Box. You know, he had what he described as a whiskey infused with orange peel.
Yeah.
He called it orange peel infused whiskey. He would clearly be in breach of the rules because it's not whiskey. It was whiskey. It's now infused with orange peel, and he called it orangery. Yeah, that's fantastic. Great drink, lovely concept, clear and transparent, and doesn't offend any rules. It makes it clear. Now, on the other side of that, and you can say this is tautology and Dominic get a life, but on the other side of that, Angel's Envy is called a port cask infused bourbon. No, it's not. It can't be a bourbon anymore. It's been in a port cask. It's bourbon infused in a port cask. Now, it might sound like tautology, but it's hugely different in terms of definition of whiskey. And I think, and they could have called that something different. You know, something put with a style name, like Glenmorangie did with its finishes. It's Nectar d'Or and all that sort of thing. In fact, I think they had a quick Reuben, I think is Portuguese, isn't it? Yeah, it's a port cask. So Quinta Reuben, you know, it might be a bit pretentious, but it's clearly making the points that and that is whiskey because it was totally within the rules. But that's what I'm saying. To take the rules away from a category, just be transparent and use your imagination a bit. I've always wanted a column called Out There, and I'd love to have a column monthly that I could just write about something I discovered. I'm tasting at the moment these amazing Scottish liqueurs, and made with from foraged things. Well, foraged.
Yeah, berries and that. Yeah.
Things. Anyway, but there's 3 different ones. And they're from Scotland. They're made by an independent company. One's an aperitif. One's good with apple juice. The other is too sweet for me, but it's apparently really nice. So ice cream. And this is creative, but they're not pretending it's whiskey. Yeah. You know, so I'm all for people branch out, but I think you need to defend that word.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing you kind of touched on there a little bit as well was finishes in whiskey. And I know there's a lot of confusion in the sense of people think, you know, a lot of these finishes are there just purely to cover up poor whiskey in the first place. But I know talking from Graham, who used to be at Glenmarie, and he's obviously now at Ingle, he kind of had a program where he used first fill bourbon casks to get the initial maturation and then a proper finish afterwards. I mean, what are your thoughts on finishes in whiskey? Do you think it's a good thing, or do you think it's kind of not needed?
Well, before I answer that, can I shoot across there and grab a bottle? Because somebody asked what liqueurs these were I talking about. I haven't a clue. 1 second.
Yeah, not a problem.
I literally, that was it.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough.
So the company...
You can hold it up if you want, you know, we don't mind advertising. Dave does it regular.
It's only a tiny company. Can you see that?
Just slightly up a little bit, please. Yeah.
So if you go on to AELD, ERELIXIR, so that's elderelixir.com. You'll find them. This is
I mean, this is where we normally have. Yeah.
I'm not employed by them, and
no.
My friend Gillian Bell sent them to me. They're literally at base camp. I think they've sold a bottle in Australia once, but really fabulous quality. And there's a lot of forest stuff in there, and quality is excellent. not everybody's cup of tea. This is 17%. This is wild elderflower elixir, handcrafted in Scotland. And there you are.
No, I mean, we don't mind advertising. We normally have this chap on called Dave, who always puts up a bottle of this world whiskey stuff from Boutique, and you would assume he was being paid by them, but he's just some strange chap that just somehow gets on here every now and again.
What worries me is what else he does in his life, because wherever I go, he pops up. He's everywhere. And he's so passionate and hardworking as Dave. I'll tell you, I've so much admiration for him. Hi, Dave. I've already spoken to earlier. He's he got the chance. I mean, he got the chance to work with an exciting company, and he's even got his own label now, and he deserves it. Fantastic. That's serious commitment, that guy.
Yeah, no, I mean, we assume he's actually been cloned, because he's probably, I've got a picture of him sat up in my top corner now, and he's probably mowing the grass, and he's probably doing a tasting in Australia at the same time. So, he's quite a multitasker.
I don't think you can. Today, he looks like he's in the Smurfs.
It's a good job we're recording this. This is definitely going out. But no, one interesting thing that I kind of think with, again, going back to the finishes, that and kind of where you said the provenance and the traceability and things like that, and I do think that's a very important issue. Obviously, there is a third issue that's going around at the moment, but we'll not talk about that just yet. But traceability and provenance is extremely important, I think. And I know you've touched on it before about, say, companies buying whiskey from somebody else and then putting it out under a false label in another country and things like that. I mean, would you like to elaborate on that a little?
It comes back to the transparency thing. I mean, in a sense, you could say, you see, I don't mind. I don't think there's anything wrong with independent bottling sector. In fact, I would say the contrary. If you're a fan of, it's like being a fan of Bruce Springsteen. You get your official releases from time to time, but the bootlegs are the ones that, some of them aren't as good as others. Some are really fantastic. And I love to make the comparison between my time as a music journalist before I was a whiskey writer. So all I've done is drank and stayed up too late. That's my living, really. But what they have in common is we've lost a lot of, with their technology, we've lost a lot of the old record shops where you look through and you discover an original Elvis release or something. That's kind of gone because, and I hope that's why where we are with whiskey gives that same sort of thing, that you'll be going out there and everyone else will be going out there and suddenly saying, I've found something really great. The boutique whiskey company's just done this 16-year-old Aberfeldy, whatever it is. And everyone goes, way, great, because that's the fun, that's the pleasure, that's the excitement of it. So I don't have a problem with people buying distillery stock and bottling it, providing it as, again, we tell people we've done it. It's the boutique whiskey company's Aberfeldy. It's probably a single cask, it's a cask strength, and it's not what Aberfeldy 16-year-old would taste like if you bought it from the distillery shop. Good. But my problem is passing off stuff. I think we've gone past the state. In fact, I'd say one of the things that may come out of this pandemic, I hope, is that we'll have a lot more about provenance and locality. And, one of the first things I did in lockdown was to start getting delivered cider from a little tiny Norfolk cider maker. And that we're using a local butcher. I'm hoping that actually what we'll gather from this is, yes, it's great that we've got these international brands, but I'll be down at the English Whiskey Company, etc. And I think that's, I think that's really the way to go. And I just don't see why we should tolerate people passing something off as theirs if it's not. I just don't get it.
Yeah. I mean, is there anybody in the group that's got any questions that doesn't involve world whiskey at the moment? Because we'll come back to that. So for a change, there's not many questions coming up on the side at the moment. So you're obviously doing quite a good job. But I noticed Richard's just unmuted, so he's probably going to talk. So we'll be here for about half an hour again now.
Eagle-eyed, mate. Well done. Yeah. It was only hello, Dom. It was only a question about publishing. You were talking about earlier about it being a bit different now to how it was when you started out. Do you have any tips for anyone watching that might be interested in writing a book about whiskey? You know, you can publish things online these days, or you know, is it worth still going to a traditional publisher and getting sort of paperback?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it comes back to what I was saying before. If you've got an angle or an idea, it's always the trouble is publishing is it's very difficult to make it work. It tends to be, you know, you're J.K. Rowling or you're not, and I think it's very, very hard to do. But you're quite right about self-publishing. I'm reading a book at the moment that I've been asked to read, to write a foreword for, or to do a comment for the back of, and it's on Japanese whiskey. And the guy who's written it lives in Japan, and it's basically, he's gone out and bought over a period of time 50 whiskies, and he's done a kind of underview. Now, he reckons that his book will be the 5th book on whiskey from Japan, and mine was the 1st. And I don't know who the 4th one is. I know that Dave Broom did one, and I know that a guy who lives in Tokyo has written one because he contributed to my book. But he's doing his online, and he's done a really good job with it. It looks great. It's well presented, and he's you know, and he's just reached out to me and said, would I read it and comment? And if he thinks it's good enough, would I comment officially and write forward? And I will. But that route is good because there's so many people now on the blogosphere that actually you can get that message out to actually get. Whereas the trouble with writing for a major publisher is that a lot of the time you just get lost. You don't see it, you know. It's the odd copy appears somewhere and you don't really get any. You'd be amazed. For a starter, you don't get anybody editing. You do it all yourself. You have somebody in a publishing house who's looking at it from the grammatical and spelling end, but not from the content end. You know, I could write the next big thing is pink whiskey and it would appear.
Right.
So you've got no, and all I'd say is reach out to people, because I got so much support, and I would support anybody with any questions or any information. But the key thing is to find an angle, something that really I mean, his book is rough. The Japanese book is a bit rough and ready, but that's good because you get the feeling. You get the feeling he's walking around Japan picking up bottles, which is kind of what he did. It's all over the place. I mean, you know, he suddenly got a review of some Scotch whiskey that's only available in Tokyo, and you think, why? But it's okay because it's not polished and it's not like mine was, standoffish and, you know, out of the fray. So that's what I'd say is get an idea, float it to people you trust and get feedback, and then when necessary, if you need advice and guidance or thoughts, ask for them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I appreciate that answer. Yeah.
I mean, while we're sort of talking about books, Dominic, I know one of your books was The World's Best Whiskies. So obviously this one that I'm looking at. In there, you're kind of saying, you know, there's 750 unmissable whiskies to try. Is there any plans of keeping, you know, sort of as though you do almost a yearly one of those or a bi-yearly one? Because obviously those whiskies are changing all the time and there's new things coming up. So is there any plans to do something again like that? Or
the problem is the nature of publishing. So that one you're talking about, there was a new version of that maybe a year ago.
Yeah.
But they told me, because they won't expand the book, so you have to remove stuff to put new stuff in, which is fine. But they would only pay to replace 10% of the book. So I changed quite a few of the features because that particular book, I think it works because the features, you can change some of the features so that it's almost like an interview thing going on.
Yeah.
But 10% isn't a lot. The worst example I've ever seen of this was I was in a distillery. It was quite a long time ago now, maybe 10 years ago. And am I straight and everything? I've tried to plug my...
Yeah. Yeah, fine.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I was in a distillery. I was looking through the whiskey books. Sadly, tried to see if mine was there. No. My name. No. And there was a brand new looking book by Jim Murray. So I thought, well, I didn't know he'd got a book coming out, but typical Jim, he wouldn't tell you. So I'm looking through it, and this is in about 2010, 2012. The entry for Brook Laddie saying the distillery was closed, but there were rumours that it had been purchased. It was going to be reopening sometime soon. And as I looked through at this book, I realised what they'd done is they just put new cover on an old book with Jim Murray's name on it, and resold it. And it was absolutely out of date. But you have no control over that. So you've got two problems. Firstly, as soon as it comes out, it's out of date anyway, because it's probably a 4 or 5 month gap between finishing a book and because they make it all up in China and ship it back. And if you're a Christmas release, it probably gets back into warehouses August and isn't released until late September, October. So your time length, you finished it in May. So already the book's out of date. And then, as you quite rightly say, the speed of releases coming through now, it's just impossible to keep up with. And publishers won't pay. So that's why Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible is so important. It's important because he'll be there now, this minute, tasting stuff and working to the latest possible deadline. He always tries to finish his book before the cricket season ends because he loves cricket, but he rarely gets to play anymore because he's still messing around with, and then he publishes quite late in the year, and it's as up to date as it's possible to be. The other one is Ingvar Runder's. He does a great job too.
Yeah, the Malt Whisky Yearbook. And
to follow up Richard's question, both of those are published by the authors, not by an independent company. Jim Murray fought a legal case to get his name back because he didn't even own his own name. And when he wanted a pay rise some years ago, they said no. So he said, right, I'm not writing it. And the next thing, people are turning up at distilleries saying they're writing for the Jim Murray Whiskey Bible. And he eventually took legal action to get his own name back. And so it goes to prove that those two books, the most current and up-to-date, are both independently published. I won't write another whiskey book unless it's on a topic like, I'd love to do one with something with new micro distillers and something along those lines, but I don't want to write another book with reviews in it because one, I struggle now my alcohol consumption was off the scale.
Yeah.
And I don't think I could do it justice. But for the other reason is the reason you said, that your opinion and Dave Worthington's opinion and other people's opinion going online today, I think collectively are much more valuable than my opinion in 6 months. So,
I mean, I don't think anybody's opinion in a sense is more valuable than anybody else's or important, because I think everybody's opinion is an opinion, and that's the point of it all, that, we give an opinion out, and I don't think any of us ever turn around and say, what I say is gospel. I mean, I know some people like to say Jim maybe does, but
a Bible.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we should replace the Bible in most hotel rooms with Jim's Whiskey Bible. It might get read a bit more. But I do think that we all give an opinion, and some people that goes to the head. That they think their opinion is final. And the thing I try to get over to everybody is, look, if you do read my blog, which I think it's just my mum that does, that is just an opinion, and that's all it is, and it should be taken that way. And it kind of doesn't matter whether you're an amateur like me or professionals like you and Jim and people like that. I mean, we all know Jim's the guy that we all love to hate. He's made a living kind of out of, in a sense, being controversial. But it's his opinion at the end of the day, and that's all it is.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I think that I think that there are people who seem to think that it's the same with music, that as you learn more, you eventually go back to the Velvet Underground and early Bob Dylan, and then to the blues, B.B. King, and you get that to roots, and you know, they publish the top 50 albums of all time. I don't own any of them. And it's the same with whiskey. They think that the more you learn, you're eventually going to get to this holy grail that you know whiskey. The reality is that there is nothing. Iron Maiden are equally as valuable to the progression of rock music as B.B. King. Maybe not as founding, but if you'd seen Iron Maiden in 1979 when music was shot, and this band came on stage and ripped the floor off the place, and here we are 40 years later and they're still doing it. You know, to me, that's opinion. But the reality is that there is no route that is going to make you a godhead in whiskey or rock music. You know, tell me the Sex Pistols aren't a valuable band. You know, they're the equivalent to them are some of the whiskies coming out of Hartwood in Australia. You know, they're smashing, bashing, crashing, energetic, enthusiastic, off the scale, tastes like nothing you've ever tasted before. I love Hartwood. I love Tim Duckett's attitude to life. Everything about that distillery I love. But you compare it to Macallan, well, it doesn't compare. It's just not.